Hey Corey,
Hey, Greg.
how you doing?
Well,
Cool, cool. Good to be talking to you today. So, die-hard blogging fans, viewers may know us, but for the benefit of any casual viewers out there, I'm Greg Marx. I am the one of the editors of Columbia Journalism Review's United States Project, and you are.
Corey Hutchins. I'm a correspondent for Columbia Journalism Review's United States Project, and I cover North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia.
Cool. South Carolina has interesting political culture, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit at the end of the conversation here.
I hope
But
we can, yeah.
cool. But I think we're going to start with you were actually took a long trip outside your home region just last week out to Montana to the like a big seminar hosted by the National Institute for Money and State Politics.
That's right.
Right, where you were a panelist and an observer at lots of other panels, and so I think you've got some stuff to share with us. Why don't we to back up a little bit? This group, I think their website is followthemoney.org and run by a guy named Ed Bender, who's been very helpful to CJR. Um, it might be useful to sort of money and state politics is kind of like not the sort of major political discourse, major national political discourse, obviously about DC. um why don't we talk for a minute about why money and state politics is a thing? Is there more of it now, and is it something to be sort of uniquely worried about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, and this was actually brought up a little bit in the conference, everybody kind of focuses in DC and New York City, the big major media markets. A lot of people focus on what's going on at the federal level and not so much the state level. But there is a lot of new spending going on in state legislatures, and I think what we've seen happen, and this might be a little more speculative or analysis, but is that at the federal level, things just aren't getting done much anymore. It's not so much like they used to. And we've seen people that have a lot of money and are willing to spend it to get their agendas through have kind of abandoned the federal level and taken their fights to the individual states where they feel they can get a lot more bang for their buck and wage their campaigns in a smaller market and deal with folks at the state levels. And we've seen that happen in several areas across the country. And that's really where the National Institute for Money and State Politics comes in. It's the only place. It's the gold standard for collecting information about who's spending what, who they're giving to, where, and not just individual donors now, but the Institute's rolling out a beta version with a whole bunch of new information. And they've got a new website with a new data architecture that brings in how much is being spent from political action committees. And they're even drilling down into the local level in some cities, and I think that's going to expand more too.
All right, cool. So we should talk about. I'm interested to hear more about that. So to back up for a second, I mean, it's true that not much is getting done in DC, right? And part of that is, I mean, I think there's been some research on lobbying that part of what lobbying and I mean, there's money spent in the campaign process. There's money spent on lobbying. The lobbying in particular, part of it is just to basically big interests who want to defend the status quo. That's one of the things that lobbying does, right, is to prevent things from getting done. But if you do want to sort of advance a change in the agenda, I think you're right that the states are sort of more fruitful terrain to do that now. One of the really interesting things that's happened in American politics is that the state legislatures have really polarized, right? So there's been some other reporting on this. There's a fantastic series in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel recently about what's happened there. But it's happened in other states recently too, and certainly sort of coordinated money through the parties has helped entrench one party or another in different states, even where there hasn't been a huge shift in the sort of partisan shape of the electorate. And North Carolina, one of the states where you're where you're based, has gone, sort of hard Republican at the state level in recent years.
Very
And
fast.
yeah, very fast. and without sort of necessarily the electorate becoming substantially more Republican or more conservative. A lot of that is just about the Republican Party being more effective at politics. There may be other factors too, but certainly, sort of like having the resources and the money has helped them do that. Another factor, so that's like one way in which money in state politics is sort of like something to pay attention to. Another factor is, there's certainly corruption in Washington, but the sort of like quid pro quo stuff that it was probably all over the place in the Gilded Age, and into much later, is actually probably, I'm outside of my area of my expertise here, so maybe we'll have some commenters correct me, but I think something to worry about less in an era where you have a lot of true believers in Congress. So to the extent that you're worried about like the corrupt hack factor of, sort of like lawmakers for sale, we do have a lot of true believers in state legislatures too, now increasingly of both parties, but there's probably more, the corrupt hack factor is probably higher in state legislatures and, even in lower levels of government than it is in DC right now.
I think that you're right, and I think that actually, to add to that, I think there's been kind of a whole new level of awareness to that. And as somebody at the conference said, and I think it was Ed Bender, who directs the National Institute on Money and State Politics, I think he said that we're kind of reached a watershed moment. We're in the disclosure era. People are really interested in, where money's going and how it's affecting politics and policies that affect their daily lives. And the information that's available now through different organizations across this country working together and collaborating is getting to a point where all that information is available. You have groups like the Institute who are doing it on a state level. You have Open Secrets, the Center for Responsive Politics. The director was actually at this conference. You have organizations like GuideStar. The CEO and president of GuideStar was at this conference as well, and that's an organization that sheds light on nonprofits and where money is coming in and going from nonprofits. You mentioned about politicians being for sale. The state newspaper in South Carolina, in Columbia, where I lived for a dozen years, they just this year did a series that we wrote about at CJR briefly earlier this year called State House for Sale. That was a series where they examined special interest money going to lawmakers and political action committees and how that might affect legislation at the State House.
Right. So you were talking about the Follow the Money's new tool, which is out in beta. So what does that do? How does that sort of advance our ability to sort of organize or sort of see patterns in this information? And what can people find if they check it out?
So if you go to followthemoney.org, you'll see it says, try our beta version. You click on that, and what Ed Bender kind of unveiled this to the conference, and he wants people like you and me to take a look at this, mess around with it, play with it, and see if we can find weaknesses and strengths it and see what works and if there's any thing that they can improve. And they have all this new information about, basically, it's a really good resource for any journalist who wants to know who the donors are that are, giving money to not just politicians anymore, but also to the parties, the Republican and Democratic parties and other parties, and committees, political action committees, and other organizations. And they've got now all this information about lobbyists, who's registered in all 50 states, who their clients are, how what they spend correlates with policy measures, things like that. And they do also data analysis on the website where they kind of take a look at some trends in, say, like energy markets or private prisons. They say these are the people behind the initiatives that are passing at these state houses. So you can basically go into that website and ask any question and get an answer to it. There are just a whole bunch of different crosstabs that didn't used to be there, where you can find. And also, what I like about it is once you kind of dial up the information you want and get it really specific, you hit this button and it shows you some like infographics and graphs, and you can save your work, and you can kind of save it in this master document and send it out to other folks and see if they want to add to that. And then I think they want to get it to the point where we can actually start embedding these into our stories should we use them in publications.
That would be pretty cool. And I hope that they continue developing this through the beta. They do have some this group, for the reasons we talked about, and there are other groups that do a good job tracking state money as well. But this group is that is their reason for being. They've got a lot of data, and the sort of presentation or search of it has been a little balky in the past. So it's great to see them focusing on making it sort of like more user friendly, because there's a lot of stuff there, and it can also help journalists know when maybe a theory doesn't exactly pan out, which is an experience that we had when you were using it a couple months ago, right?
Yeah. So that was a story that I was looking at that didn't pan out, and the reason that we didn't publish it was because we were able to track the data. I'll just tell you what happened. So this was like the height of the scandal in Virginia involving the governor, who's under a federal investigation and going through a trial right now about whether there was some quid pro quo involving a dietary supplement manufacturer in his state who just basically gave the governor and his wife a lot of money, Lux watch, and all sorts of things. And it really scandalized Virginia because that's a state that traditionally, it really doesn't have that, corrupt reputation. And they talk about the Virginia way and Jefferson's house. So it was a national thing. But there was a story in Slate that someone wrote that was saying that the real story might be about, how a dietary supplement manufacturer gained so much political clout in a specific state. And so I remember asking you, hey, maybe this is something that we can, latch onto at the United States Project, and I can find out if the dietary supplement industry is on the rise in other states. I'm thinking, how can we do that? I called up the National Institute on Money and State Politics, and they were like, and that's when Ed Bender told me, oh, you're going to love this. Check out our new beta version. And just, he kind of walked me through it and said, go nuts, tell me what you find. And you and I were emailing back and forth as we were using this thing. And, we could really get a specific state-level data. Basically, my question was, are dietary supplement manufacturers spending more money, giving more money to politicians and political action committees and parties in the states? Has there been a significant rise in that over just the past couple of years or so? And pretty quickly, we were able to determine that while it had been kind of steadily on the rise for the past decade or so, there really wasn't much going on. And so it didn't really pan out for the story, but it certainly, opened my eyes to, number one, how easy it was to use this program to find that out. And two, it really just kind of showed me that, you can spot trends pretty easily in using this information.
Right. And good story foiled by the data.
Yeah.
Cool. So I know there are a whole bunch of other sort of panels out there, and I know there were a couple others sort of presentations that you were telling me about that you were interested to talk a little bit more about. Did you want to talk about Crowdpac?
Yeah. So there were about 50 people at this conference, and it was a pretty good mix of scholars and academics. There were a handful of journalists there. There were, pretty much anybody interested in working in the intersection of money and politics at the national level and state level. There were some government officials there. The vice chair of the Federal Elections Commission was there. And so we had some political scientists as well. And one of them was Adam Bonica, and he is a political science professor at Stanford, and his research involves trying to quantify the ideologies of politicians. And he's come up with this. He and his team have come up with this website called Crowdpac, and you can find it at crowdpac.com. And really, right now, it's in the beginning stages, and it focuses on California. And he gave this presentation, and he said basically that he went to the polls recently, and he gets there he sees the ballot, and he's like, here I am, a political scientist with a PhD, and I'm looking at this ballot with like 30 names on it,
right.
And I don't know some of these people and what they stand for, and that's something that even I've felt guilty going to the polls in my hometown before, being a local reporter and seeing a ballot for like somebody on the water commissioner. I'm like, man, I never even read a story about this race. So sometimes you just don't know who these people are on the ballot. So what he wanted to do is find a very easy way where people with not a lot of time on their hands can just go to a website and kind of click around and say, like, these are the issues I'm interested in. Here is where I stand on this particular issue. Here's another politician I kind of like. And you put this information in, and you put in where you're going to vote, and it just comes out and says, well, you'll probably like this guy, and or this person over here in these different races, whether it be federal, state, or local. And what they do is they crunch the numbers for, obviously they take a look at the politician's voting record, but it goes beyond that. They actually go through and scrape all sorts of data about what these politicians have said, what they say in their campaign ads, and what they've said in the press, and put all this information together to kind of get this kind of narrative picture of who these people are and why you might consider voting for them based on the information you put out.
Gotcha. Is there a big ideological split in water commissioner?
I wish I could tell you.
So it's a launching pad, famous launching pad to the governor's mansion.
Right.
In some states, maybe it is. Gotcha. Cool. Anything else that you want to talk about from the conference? What was the panel that you were on? What insights did you bring to the assembled dignitaries?
Well, I talked a lot about what we do with the United States Project. I talked about some of the things that we've written about recently. And I'll tell you some of the things that folks came up to me afterward to talk about. I mentioned that story. We wrote this story a few months ago about public funding for newspapers, and how we found these two cities relatively, pretty far apart, but close together in time, had allowed direct money from local governments to fund these newspapers. One was in Fitchburg, Wisconsin. It was where a city government basically decided, hey, we are in a no newspaper town. We need a newspaper. We're willing to put up the money if somebody wants to do this. And it kind of, it of course causes conflicts of interest questions. And, we looked at those, but I wondered if it was going to become a trend because we saw this other newspaper this community newspaper in North Carolina getting like $100,000 loan from City Hall. So folks were interested about that because everybody knows that, the newspaper industry has been on the decline for a while. And
really,
these are a group of people who are interested in, there were a lot of, philanthropic funders at this event. So there's a lot of talk about, what can we do to strengthen the infrastructure of the democracy reform movement. And of course, some of that involves media. And so there's some talk about, of course, this led to, a discussion about the rise in think tank journalism. We've written about that. I've covered a think tank reporter in South Carolina. Our correspondent, Anna Clark, covered one in Michigan. So those certainly sparked plenty of debate.
Yeah, I was interested in the piece that you were talking about sort of local papers getting support from City Hall, and we actually discovered after publishing the piece that I think there have been some other instances of black or other ethnic papers getting support from local government, and that was the case in I think it was the North Carolina paper that we wrote about in the Wisconsin. It was just essentially a suburban community wanted coverage of local government. In addition to, I think they picked up the printing cost for a year, but they also shuttered the sort of like municipal newsletter to sort of force local advertisers. That was kind of the biggest thing that they gave them. They sort of like got rid of the print advertising competition. Um, um, but anyway, I was surprised by how many, like in the reaction to the piece, a number of people, I'm not sure if they were journalists, but sort of like journalistic thinkers, people who, tweet about these issues, who said like, yeah, this is actually sort of needs to be a part of the funding mix going forward, and we're not so troubled by the conflict of interest considerations. So
I agree, and I wonder, I think, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this before, but I wonder if this comes down to just this kind of, everybody talks about how journalism is changing. You hear criticisms of the media that, we're so partisan now. You can go and get your right-wing news from Fox News and your left-wing news from MSNBC and hope that there's somewhere in the middle if you want to, sit there and watch C-SPAN, I guess. No, or CNN or something like that. So if we're going into our different silos to get our news, are we just kind of giving up on the idea that the mainstream media is objective and that we don't care so much anymore who's paying for it, and we're just taking it on its own terms and judging it on the content? And if there is kind of a growing perception of that, then really who would care if the government was paying for it, as long as you can still kind of take a look at that and say, well, clearly they're not reporting very hard on the mayor of this town, and we know why.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, obviously the sort of like types of papers we're talking about aren't engaging in sort of like national political, coverage or anything like, or, for the most, or, probably even local politics is not, well, it's part of the mix. It's part of their content mix, but it's not necessarily the core of what they do. Although, nobody else is doing it, so you hope that they would do some. But yeah, I guess it's possible that people are becoming more like, ecumenical or sort of like less strict in terms of how they think about where the money comes from. I don't know. At the you were in a room with all sorts of like goo reformer types, or maybe not exclusively, but a lot of people who have all sorts of like spend their professional time worrying about like ethics issues and stuff like that. When you talked about it, was the response like, well, anything to support media, or was the response more like run away from that?
I think it was mixed. It was like, I mean, I remember somebody pretty much said something like, well, you guys need all the help you can get, right? So I think yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of that. But this actually, on the other side of the spectrum here, we can talk maybe about a recent story that we published at our United States project about the reporter Rick Brundrett, who works for the Nerve, which is a new media website. It's an investigative reporting outlet that's housed inside of the libertarian think tank called the South Carolina Policy Council. And,
right.
Here's a situation where you have, as we wrote, by nearly all accounts, a very straight-laced, right down the middle, kind of old school reporter who's getting his paycheck from a think tank that doesn't disclose its donors, a think tank that clearly has, somewhat of an agenda about limiting government and taking power away from the legislature, making government more open and promoting ethics reform and a host of other, policy issues. And yet he's reporting on state government. And we can kind of maybe use this to transition to what we should talk about what's going on in South Carolina right now.
Yeah, sure.
How this plays.
So what's going on in South Carolina, besides the sort of running controversies over multiple controversies, maybe about whether you're allowed to be an atheist in state government, but the other shit, like this bizarre sort of like intra-Republican Party feud between the Attorney General and the sort of State House Speaker, right? Who's been dogged by ethics questions for years, probably, I think, and is now subject of a probe. And actually, as we wrote about, tried to have a ruling on whether the AG could investigate him be conducted in secret.
Yes.
And that ruling turned out to be public, but then there was a public ruling that the AG could not be investigating him. Am I getting this right? And then
it's a bizarre situation.
Yeah, but then the AG said he was going to investigate him anyway. So it is kind of it's a soap opera, but also sort of like substantive. And meanwhile, the guy the Brundrett who you talked about is working as journalist based at a think tank whose head lodged the ethics complaint that became the source for the probe into the House Speaker.
That's right. And one of the things that's interesting.
We need a flow chart for all of this. It's an infographic.
Yeah, that's true. But I would get away from framing it as a kind of intra-party Republican, infighting and more of the, substantive effects of what could actually happen because of this ruling, and it involves pretty much like all of the state government's institutions at this point, from the legislature to the state court system. And South Carolina is one of these states where lawmakers elect state judges, including those who sit on the state Supreme Court. And we just had a big race for the Supreme Court Chief Justice here in South Carolina, and the Speaker of the House, who's the one who's under investigation, he, wrangled votes to get the Chief Justice reelected. And now they're going to have this hearing to see if whether the AG can actually, or the House Speaker can actually get the AG kicked off this case, and it's gone all the way up to the state Supreme Court. They're going to hear this on June 24th. But from the media perspective, what was interesting was finding out that a reporter who's done an awful lot of covering this from the beginning is working literally right upstairs from his boss, who's the woman who is the head of this think tank, who was the one who submitted a formal complaint to the Attorney General's office and said, you should investigate the state's most powerful politician, and we need you to do it because we have no faith in the House Ethics Committee, which is the legislative panel that's made up of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, half of which have taken money affiliated with the Speaker's, with a political action committee with ties to the Speaker. And the Speaker appoints these members to other committees, and of course they need his help to get legislation through, so there's conflicts there. And so it was a rare move for the AG to take this case. I don't think he wanted to take the case, but I think after looking at it, he decided, well, we better. And it's just been a whirlwind to watch this titanic clash of 2 of the state's most prominent political players, who happen to be part of the same party, fighting over what essentially comes down to whether lawmakers in South Carolina have legislative immunity from investigation from outside authorities for possible criminal wrongdoing, or whether they're subordinates in the House. It's, their colleagues and friends are supposed to watchdog them. Somebody said to me that asking the House Ethics Committee in South Carolina to investigate the House Speaker would be like asking Walt Disney to be investigated by, Donald, Mickey, and Goofy. So we'll see what happens with that, but I think it will be a test of, the efficacy of some of our state's institutions, at least here in South Carolina.
Right. And to circle back to the media angle again, I mean, your judgment in the piece we ran was that, though essentially, this guy is reporting from essentially within the institution, or he reports to the woman who was a player, a direct player in this action, his coverage has been, pretty straight, and not much to find fault with it. I mean, I wonder, we've seen this, and this relates to, the Washington Post has a story today about the Heritage Foundation's new foray into think tank journalism. And as you said, Anna wrote the piece for us in Michigan. my sort of instinct as a reader, and I think it's been borne out by the coverage, is that when the sort of journalism that comes from institutions like this is probably on safer terrain when it's when it's more sort of investigative, and you do need to as a reader sort of be like, this is essentially reporting that's being done from a prosecutorial mindset.
Yeah.
As we more or less wrote, and you maybe sort of discount that, but it still sort of like plays by the rules of good journalism. I wouldn't necessarily, and it doesn't in South Carolina. It doesn't seem like the Nerve really does much of this, but in some other places, these sort of think tank outfits do. I wouldn't really look to them for sort of like fair-minded, even-handed treatments of policy disputes that treat sort of like rival sort of policy positions with the same seriousness that they treat sort of the white papers that their sort of parent institutions are putting out.
Yeah, I agree with that, and some of the things that you certainly aren't going to see from these nonprofit think tanks, or you won't see a lot of campaign reporting. Like one thing Rick told me, I don't think this ended up in the piece, but one thing he told me was when we were talking about how he chooses what he covers. He said, I look at abuse of power, I look at conflicts of interest. And at one point he said, I look at when government tries to get involved in the free market. He said, those are things that I'll investigate. And I said, well, I noticed that I never see, you cover the State House, but I never see any campaign reporting. And he smiled and said, I'm not allowed to do it, basically. Because they would worry about somehow violating the nonprofit. Like, I guess if you take it to its logical conclusion, you could kind of, maybe make the case that a writer for one of these nonprofits could somehow violate the nonprofit status, right?
Right. Yeah,
so there are constraints as well, and I think he's recognizing that and saying, well, we're just not even going to get involved in that.
Right. I think some places play it sort of safer than others. I mean, I'm not sure that like it would necessarily be, a violation, but I can see why they especially, if it's not sort of core to the mission, they probably would say, look, other places sort of like have that, commercial media have that, sort of, that is one of the things where commercial media do tend to focus their resources. The other thing you're not going to find out of the place in South Carolina, there's a fashion in some quarters for like solutions journalism. And I don't think that's what the Nerve is all about.
Yeah. This is something else that I just thought of that occurred to me that came up on my panel I was on. Kevin Davis was there, who runs he runs INN, Investigative News Network. Right. And he was saying that some of these nonprofit journalism outfits have a really hard time getting their applications processed through the IRS. And so what INN does is becomes a fiscal home for some of these. That's one of the resources they offer, which I think is awesome because they're already established and they have their status. And he was saying that there can be a nonprofit newsroom in one state that's application is almost identical to one in another state. One can get processed in 3 months and another one can take up to 3 years to get processed. And
do they go through different offices at the IRS? Is that the issue?
I don't know what he said. Really can't ever discern what the problem is. And I think that's kind of huge. I mean, especially if we're talking about, these newsrooms filling gaps in traditional coverage. I guess, from a reader's perspective, I'd like to see a little bit more streamlined and uniformity with how they get their status. If you've got your funding and you're ready to go, and yet your application is not processed, can you do the work and can you put it out there?
Right. Yeah, we've written other stuff at CJR, not through our project, but other writers at CJR have written about this issue, and it's not the only thing with the IRS. Like some other factors with the IRS, it can be hard to find out like exactly like what the deal is or why why a situation plays out one way and not another way. But that it is sort of a confusing situation. All right, cool. Corey, anything else we should talk about today?
No, I think that does it. Thanks. It was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Good talking to you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye. See you.